Chapter 2, Scene 1. Directly above Mr. Winter's grand study, in the western wing of his home, there existed his bedroom on the second floor. And in such room, in front of its southern window, sat a plain writing desk. And at the business edge of this, in its middle section, sat a sizable journal which kept more blank pages than not, for it would some day be a chronicle of all things that came to pass concerning his personal and philosophical ventures in this particular section of the country. The journal's first entries, indeed, were his architectural sketches of this edition, in which it presently lied, followed by those of the other renovations which were eventually applied to the home, and then by quick designs of his glass-house, preluding detailed elaborations of such. Several pages later were thoughtful accounts of his visits to the area last summer, including geographical surveys, naturalistic material pertaining to the woodland, and the temperature time series he and his young visitor had constructed regarding the pipes and ambient air inside and around the glasshouse. As he sat at his desk, glancing transiently at the creation of morning by the submersion of the yonder hillside into the early sunlight through his window, he read and reread a particular anomalous passage that had also been inscribed that summer, on a night following a much more glorious morning than the present one, handsome as it was thus far, on falling in love with a young Yorkshire girl in the throes of a country walk. We did little to deserve each other than what we did those few moments rising into the morning sun. Sure, such were no less soluble than any of the 100 scents conjured by the flourishing warmth, yet they did raise to the highest power what was, just before she existed, seemingly ordinary countryside. I fear the younger audience might tend to find love a void to be occupied as soon and as frequently as possible, its depth discovered by fervent thrusting. Perhaps I am grown simple, that it may, with equal credibility, be just the accidental brushing of her hand to mine, as she gestured at some creature I pretended to see for the sake of her excitement, roused out by the starting day. I will not pretend I did not notice subtly her form. By her hair arose such mortal thoughts, for it was, again, Towton of the year of our Lord, 1461, and faith, as she came back at me from the creature, relentlessly, as if I were fit for similar observation, such a dose of riotous chemistry or cannon fire was manifest in the lines of her sex that I was levelled to a man 15 years my junior, grasping at blunt extremes in my acute description of her. Further, I had plenty of time to survey her face, the voluble character she was, twisting about me thoughts on the traversing of a most familiar plot of forest just north of the hills before us, and on her first unaccompanied ride upon her father's horse some decade ago on that self-same countryside, allowed me that. I scarcely had to say a word. And as I patiently listened to a particular part concerning the loss of her twill hunting cap and the uncooperative attitude of the chestnut in its retrieval, her hair ablaze in all directions, a small fit of wind encouraged free a bound lock of that torrid flow, which sought sweet refuge upon her cheek. Oh, but were my fingertips that lock and hers that ornery breeze! I shall not detail her face, however, for it would be a tragedy to do so. I've always found an exceptional face irreducible. My mind refuses to set it credibly, wanting instead the fair mystery before my eye, that behind it may sup the rush and flow infinitely bound to such. I shall only provide, again capitulating to bluntness, that it was young and beautiful, and that it benefited from her animation. The next several passages, having to do with his own countenance and the struggle to mitigate the painting of excited thoughts upon it, he did frown upon. They had been crossed out, and space underneath them given to reconcile their impotence, yet such had not come to pass. Nevertheless, they did currently provoke the question of his transparency, which had been born that sweet day, tossed and turned upon during waking and weightless hours, and which had been re-excavated during his recent visit with the Moors. Had he been clever and said nothing upon his face, whilst his heart called out, drowning the sound of sensibility? Or, diametrically, was he brazenly obvious by the upward curl of his inner brow and the tension in the lids of his eyes upon her, and grossly unaware of this? Alas, he did not know. That's what it was to drown. That was the effect of such. A few moments were given to this, as he watched the sunlight become more embedded in the autumn colours flowing through his window. Then, having travelled no further toward an answer, he continued. As the sun's tightened tongue lapped further at our position, the world was reduced to two odd figures, the wind, the railed fence that marked our converging paths, and the soft permeation of cathedral chimes in the wooded distance. It must have been Sunday, the day we met. I felt it proper to mar at last a tacit interval born from trailing observations we had for each other about the boxed fields and their contents beyond our fence. In doing so, my begging of her name, for she had painted every other aspect of her character necessary for me to stumble about, a damnable hobbledehoy, my topside overweighed, I was confounded by an ungovernable discharge of emotion. Depth begets depth by the sounding of a name. Her name. Faith, her name. Her name, a charmed amulet thus hung round my neck, suffused with supernatural will and revelry, that I may stand to the world with enlivened resolve, ingest its colours with an irrational augment of resonance, and have no doubt of comfort these last few earthly steps trusted to me. For these moments do arise that love is careless of curfew and refuge, that an indelible mark is made, the maker unexpected, and that a recognition so strong is to be found in another who has by naked chance shared one's bit of walking path. A pinch of space was given after this notion, and then, terminating the entry, his pen had committed a name to it. Depth begat depth by the quiet motioning of his lips as they captured its syllables, and he was mindful that he was in danger of making himself drunk dwelling upon it. However, there were vast numbers of pages here still yet to be written, most of them requiring a bare philosophical attitude. It would not do to extensively pursue romance or travel toward its permanent terminal, that, like poor Mr. Moore, he would be committed to callings in Cheltenham or the like, which convicted him to a want of time for the work of his ambitious mind. Further, in this particular case, it was not sensible to bite the hook just as it had been thrown into the water. How many a trout had suffered by such lack of caution? Done poorly, it could destroy his newfound alliance. Momentarily, he did consider that, were it not done so, that this may indeed have the opposite effect. But such a thing was improbable for his part, as he knew as little about social pageantry in the context of proper courting as most men did about Newton's fluxions of infinitesimal calculus. No, it would not do, he said, as he clamped shut his journal, sharp set for the bit of bacon, toast and dilute coffee, which he conceived were being prepared downstairs in expectation that he would be up early for the sake of appearing at Mr. Jonathan Moore's first Sunday service, posterior the parson's interval in Scotland. Chapter 2, Scene 2. "Change is upon us!" Jonathan Moore forcefully ejaculated upon his following, who had just taken their seats, crisply situated in anticipation of his reintroduction. The crowd was quite heavier in number than was usual, as a function of their affection and respect for the parson, who had been away almost a year's time. "For it is always upon us," he said in quiet contrast to his thesis, pausing to look over their familiar faces, heartily glad to be home, whilst an unfamiliar fellow in a fine blue jacket, newly arrived, tiptoed to the most distal and least crowded pew in the room. A boy becomes a young man becomes a man too then transforms into an aged man, and thusly from introduction to departure we all are swept upon the waters of change, sometimes turbulent, sometimes seemingly still but a trickle, and we likely in fear of it all. Change is always upon us, and this is not something altogether lost on the authors of our good book. Conversely to my offering we have Matthew 18, verses 1, 2, and 3. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted, and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. From Corinthians. For the love of Christ compels us, because we judge thus, that if one died for all, then all died, and he died for all, that those who live should live no longer for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. Therefore from now on we regard no one according to the flesh. even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new." Mr. Moore continued at some length, exemplifying his topic by means of verses he had picked, which were subjectively nebulous to such, adding in his own quick thoughts to the apparent delight of the crowd. Changes from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah, from Babylon to Canaan to Egypt and back again, and as Peter wrote to his dear friends, from water to earth and then to fire by the hand of God, were all enthusiastically agreed upon. He was pleased to joke, concerning a particular squeaker in attendance, of the boy's courageous submission from grime to cleanliness by means of a cold bath before the day's service. Further, he touched upon the want of variation that was characteristic of the Lord himself, executing the timing of such contrast in a manner that left little doubt in his followers of his proficiency in oration. On occasion, subsidiary conclusions were brought, and these were followed either by an appeal to pray together or by the singing of a familiar metrical psalm which incidentally, unknownst to any man present, had been made illegal just the year before by the Chancellor of the Diocese of York over a dispute on appropriate hymnody, not that tradition would be broke for an unseen northerner, regardless. And it was after their second hymn that Mr. Moore did begin his closing statements, which to the blue-jacketed Mr. Winter, though owning limited experience in matters liturgical, seemed quite uncommon. Mr. Moore's tone became more serious, as if it could at any moment surrender to a more anxious attitude. Nor was the keenly observant engineer the only one to notice this. Up the aisles, heads began to twist at a rate of higher magnitude. Looks were stolen away from the parson and given to the floor, the walls, and to each other. "Friends, I do not prattle on about change that you may be comforted about your ages, or about the occasional anomalous season that keeps our bread in the ground and the let grown short," he said privately, nodding toward his brother, who kept an exclusive pew along with the two men's families in front of the chancel. "The world around us is in a stir. We do not see it, being isolated as we are, and a fair amount among you incapable of, or indifferent to, the reading of pamphlets, papers, books, and so, originating from the learned men of our great country. But those of us that have travelled, eyes open, and have read the goings-on of this stirring, put little up against the idea that the country is immersed in stagnation, becalmed by grace, and gently floating inside perpetual sanctuary, though by heaven our little plots at Hedgely and Woodbridge, and those of a similar distal nature, may some day be the last remaining examples of the Lord's original intentions, let it not be in my lifetime." This generated a few whispered and nervous amens that reverberated about the canvas of crystalline silence that had saturated the nave, for though that beyond the towns may be a stirring, not a cough, nor a whisper, nor a creak in the pews at the adjustment of postures was present upon this last sentiment. Further, it seems only natural to conclude that this sort of phenomenon is acceleratory, that is, its hunger is enlivened by that on which it feeds, and it has had a few centuries to whet its appetite, that presently it is monstrously sharp set. We thus can entertain two possibilities in light of such. We may submit to blind hope that Providence will consistently spare us, knowing it has not done so for others about the country, and that God alone is invariant, or we may become a little prepared presently, and then a little more afterward, and still more so after that, in a gentle and inconspicuous fashion. Let me be clear and alleviate your concerns at this. We need not impress upon ourselves the agitations of this exogenous construction. We only need be ready to recognise and understand it, that we are best suited to react productively to it, were it ever to be blown onto our countryside. I will therefore beg that I may here say a few words on the concept of understanding, and then we can get on to this glorious day. Certainly our book gives us all we need know that we may live spiritually, right, humble, and sound. Yet man is of a curious nature, and some among us desire not only greater knowledge of our surround, but some among these find it Christian to search our book for this knowledge by application of their own reason to its pages, that the final product they do derive is not but the Word of God, but the Word of God and man, the latter being unprophetic at that, in examples I will share with you on coming days. However, secular understanding founded on the principles of philosophical reason, the very heart of this change I submit that is at hand, has become the thing, as it professes that for a worldly idea to be right and true, it must be shown to be so with satisfactory and often redundant lines of observable evidence. Further, for any idea to keep an exalted status, there must not be any a line of credible evidence that shows it to be implausible, for such could silence it forever. There is a refinement that occurs where a rough idea can be constantly practised upon that it becomes as polished as a pearl, whilst another next to it by the same means becomes cracked and withers away to nothingness. Mr. Moore could sense at this there was the beginning of a mute disaffection in the church. Some faces were not quick enough to hide their discomfort underneath their quizzical blinking as he placed his eyes upon them. Even his wife and daughter might have shown a bit of worry, though plainly for their part it was more for him than the subject matter. The building itself, snugged up for a colder day than had been realised, issued a sticky humidity to the nave which at present was becoming conspicuous, amplifying this vexation. Here his only ally was Mr. Winter, who seemed quite at home, unaffected by his speech, and in fact was slightly nodding in affirmation at his points. It occurred to him that his ideas were, to the room, in want of practical examples, and that he should draw upon his experiences about the parish farm to satisfy this. That the song of a given species of bird was inherent to all able members of such could be observed and laid as a natural truth, was one particular notion that came to mind. Alas, time was at hand, and he too desired to be out upon the glorious day in the throes of family leisure, and inspired by this, the parson continued to his conclusion with emphasis on its more personal aspect, deferring his example to the future. Many of you were kind enough to offer beforehand fine words about my brother Charles, whom most of you know now looks down upon us, and is the reason of my long displacement from our villages. Well, what I'm sure you may not know, or at least not have a detailed account of, is that my brother partially derived a living from the practising of this natural philosophy with which I do speak, and though I will not entertain detail, I will say that he did give his life during an expedition in pursuit of this craft. He issued a small pause at this, to watch its effect sink into the crowd. It was no doubt disturbing to those who were come for words of faith to be issued the very opposite. Still, he had faith in their goodness, that he could make a genuine appeal to sympathy. Christ sacrificed that we all may be given a chance at heaven, but men like my brother Charles sacrifice that we all may be given a chance at understanding more clearly all that lies below it, and in its knowing, appreciation may then bloom that much more for what I have thusly marked as the Lord's original intentions. I did not understand this at first, and it took me the best part of a year to do so, which I am sorry to be away so long. I felt to honour him properly, I needed to understand his work at a comprehensive depth, and therefore the man he was. I read what he read regarding philosophy. I talked a great deal with his colleagues, all fine, gentlemanly folk that our villages would be privileged to have as neighbours, to be sure, and on occasion I put private and amateur effort into generating original ideas, just to familiarise myself with the process, with which these men did politely oblige and encourage, though we all knew I had little talent along those lines. Well, having now heard me talk quite queer of the revolution and philosophy gathering outside our hills and fields, and the necessity of understanding it, I offer that in honour of my brother, I will on every other Sunday afternoon before us, alongside a wholesome dinner provided by the parish for those interested, execute a series of lectures on the most basic constructs of natural philosophy as it contrasts to the inferences deleteriously derived from our book by but men willing to do the inferring. I do invite and heartily welcome you all to take part. Come now, do not be discouraged, for it is all much more benign than what my poor speech has made it to be. Chapter 2, Scene 3. Mr. Winter watched the last of the flock exit the church, their tongues still somewhat anaesthetised from Mr. Moore's poor speech. There was no jolly discourse about the grounds one would expect from this, but weakly chance folks had to socialise, whilst temporarily relieved of their work. There were whispers, to be sure, and husbands with encouraging looks for their wives and children, who, though having had their minds a-frolicking beyond the walls of the church during Mr. Moore's conclusions, could sense from the adult's reservation that something was amiss. Old friends that did choose to engage each other did so quietly on subjects properly distal to Mr. Moore's uncommon sermon. As he reflected upon the possibility that some day the towns could resemble those of his fathers, where a significant set of the population were harvested from the fields and planted upon the mills, certainly the men he saw manually broadcasting their winter wheat seed the day he visited the moors were candidates for such, soon as their master felt inclined to adopt the now well-established seed drill and other designs of efficiency. Again he saw flashes of white calling his eyes back to focus, and again they preluded the voice of Miss Moore. "Mr. Winter! Oh, Mr. Winter! He does not hear, for he is lost about the headstones and the oaks. Ah, there you are, Mr. Winter. I am sorry to pull you from your observances and considerations, sir, but we thought you might want to walk with us into Hedgely. We are to call upon the Edwards and break bread with them, soon as I've delivered this basket of apples to the plough for our little friend. This is my cousin, Charlotte Moore, my uncle's daughter." References had been made to Charlotte Moore the day Mr. Winter had visited Woodbridge Manor, yet none had, understandably, described her fine physical form, nor the manner in which such was carried, a sight most striking to most members of the male sex, even upon consideration of her age, that 10 years senior to Harriet Moore's. Sure, she was not her younger cousin's equal, for very few about the country were, but she was a very agreeable second that Mr. Winter could have lost his manners and exclaimed, "What a shame there are two Miss Moores, for I have but one heart to lose." Charlotte had failed, or was presently failing to marry, not from want of interest, but from a combination of lack of suitable interest concerning income and her personal necessity of staying close at hand to, perhaps, Woodbridge Manor, but more so to its lush countryside of rolling hills and forests, for like the younger Miss Moore and her father regarding his apples, she too adored the local natural surround, a family trait, one might suppose. She was not as venturous as Harriet, wandering about the wood alone, but was vigilant to the daily opportunities at hand, such as today's accompaniment of her cousin to the Edwards, for which she brought along the missing book that inspired such trouble in their library the day Mr. Winter had been introduced, Bewick's History of British Birds. "Ah, yes, well, thank you, Miss Moore. I am—" Mr. Winter struggled that he may find a credible conception that kept him from betraying his sentiments formulated that morning, for though a walk was innocent enough, there loomed the chance that it may become a Sunday routine were it to be a successful one this day. And in such, there too was a not insignificant forecast for trouble. With two beautiful Miss Moores, certainly there lied the capacity for all sorts of trouble. He also desired to be left to his thoughts on, and the preparation of, the experiments that were to occur in his glasshouse during the colder seasons. He did presently require local seed, and some of this he had planned to purchase from his northern neighbour, the master of those manual broadcasters, that afternoon. Such entailed, with consideration to efficiency of time and path, that he once again stormed the wood and blazed down the northern fields of Hedgely, surely not what the Moore ladies had in mind in their Sunday finery, fit for civil calling. "I am sure it is proper, Mr. Winter, if that is what vexes. Come, having met now thrice, we are old friends, and by my word we shan't burden you with fainting over puddles and the like," she further offered, recognising some level of hesitancy was afoot. Her persuasion, however, did not extinguish this, but to her surprise had something of an opposite effect. Charlotte grew a quizzical brow, whilst Mr. Winter briefly looked away over the gravestones, struggling to mask his astonishment, a countenance similar to that drawn upon him during their meeting at her uncle's. Darting looks at Charlotte, as if to observe her assessment of the conversation, he replied, "Thank you, Miss Moore, but forgive me. We were but introduced this last Wednesday, and considering this particular discourse, such would sum to only twice being in each other's presence, and then added, having noticed the now infectious bewilderment being passed around the small group upon her brow and flickering lashes, Yet may I say that so pleasant have been these, that they very well could fill a thrice or four course of meetings. You do, in fact, remind me so readily of an amiable young Yorkshire lady I did meet this summer upon your very Woodbridge hill. She, too, was a parson's daughter with the dearest laugh and highest spirit. Lord, how strange! Another Yorkshire family, cried Charlotte, but propriety doused her curiosity. She did want to inquire more about this woman, whom she'd never seen nor heard of, for she thought she knew all the fine ladies of the area, but her interruption did only seem to inflame the queerness of these expositionary remarks, that she begged with her eyes Mr. Winter's forgiveness, and that he may go on to finish his thoughts. Had he said too much? All sorts of trouble, he repeated inwardly, as he felt the gravity of the younger Miss More's venereal qualities, now even more resonant secondary to her slight embarrassment, and that of Charlotte's expectations weighing upon him. Nothing to it, then, but to walk with these two down Westfield, making what reparations need be necessary, and collect my seeds in the morn, he conceded. Well then, ladies, shall we begin our journey? He said through a genuine smile with his arm extended, gesturing at the path before them. Alas, such was taken well, and they found much to say about the triumph of walking, as opposed to the stuffy, cramped, and sometimes physically shocking experience that a carriage would provide on an uneven road. They too did all agree that Compton Lane, with its wooded embellishments, sounds of the river, and voidance of post-coaches, was the superior walking path in comparison to the upper leg of Westfield Road, and took the route in hopes of citing a few specimens from Charlotte's book. Indeed, Compton Lane did afford many delights in attempted identifications of the several avian varieties they came across, and there too was much small talk of other visual points of interest along the road. But as they jollily crossed the great bridge at the lane's conclusion and alighted onto Westfield Road, Mr. Winter published a rather thoughtful look upon his face and asked the younger of the ladies, "Miss Moore, might you know what inspired your father's speech this morn?" "I am apprehensive that my agreement with your uncle might have to do with at least part of it, that it was preemptive my solicitations I shortly will make with a few of your uncle's tenants." There was a silent stir about the room, and a bit more laboured breath and the like in the rows in front of me, were I at all interpreting it correctly. "Oh, you needn't worry on that account, Mr. Winter. I've never known uncle to write, persuade, or otherwise affect father's work, having too much of his own to chew upon. But more so to the point, I'm quite sure father had been practising that speech long before your calling at Woodbridge Manor," she returned, having indeed heard her father labour more than usual whilst polishing his talk. "Well then, I am in turn quite relieved to hear it so." Many a shy stare was cast toward myself as we were clearing out afterward, as if there existed some common knowledge of my intentions, and such were being perceived as the implosion of the towns against the forces of the modern momenta. I was thankful for your concluding organ performance, as it gave me the excuse to sit a little longer and listen, that I be allowed to dissolve out of the flock's acute focuses. Faith, what folk will do when in group that they would otherwise not in the sensibility of solidarity. And what they do, but fresh released from under the watch of the steeple. "Oh, ha, ha, ha," laughed Miss Moore. "Oh, Harriet, your father, my uncle, would not hear such coming from the mouth of his dearest of family," cried Charlotte, who only appeared surprised at this for the sake of Mr. Winter. She was used to her cousin's occasional lack of socially minded sensibility inside their private intimacy, for when they were alone together, she would sometimes remark on the most unladylike philosophies, which Charlotte felt were derived from excessive use of the Manor's library. "But 'tis true, saints but for the hour and sinners for the rest of the week," the younger Miss Moore jested, as she lightly tugged upon the brim of Charlotte's bonnet, causing her cousin to smile while securing it with both hands. "You do not find that a sermon enlivens a listener's goodwill and virtue, then?" Mr. Winter inquired, he too amused by the liberties of the parson's daughter, so very like his Yorkshire girl on the hill months ago. "I'll confess I have little proper evidence to the contrary," said Harriet. "Yet I hesitate to discount that they are inherent to an individual, and not altogether the result of constant instruction. Some may benefit from this instruction, greatly or marginally, most in between, whilst others will only continue in the directions Providence, or some secular cousin to such, has dealt them, unswayed by the boom of the parson, savouring bifurcated eternities. I see no reason why this latter group would not be a significant set of the whole. Take, for instance, our little friend, for which I carry this basket of apples. Her family presents to church on Christmas alone, yet does she not scurry home when called? Tend the plot her father rents out back his home when asked, and think the best of men, even of Mrs. Edwards, whom I did witness openly express indifference toward at the plough the day after your final arrival to town. Further, it was my instruction, not that of my father, which has kept her from your trees since that day. And who am I through her eyes, but a friend and not altogether a representative of the clergy? Yes, I do feel bad about the trees, my servants being overzealous with them, he returned. I would plant a few more, but that she too would mature along with them, and thus have lost interest by their bearing. It is most kind of you to bring her those products of your uncle's trees, and I'm sure she would delight in knowing the varieties, the curious little creature. But for my part, I would offer the following experiment. Examine 2 sets of folk, those that are pleased to present to their pews on a weekly basis, and those that are of a more relaxed schedule, such as those of your tailor's family, and the more like to them the better, concerning frequency of presentation. In each of these sets, the examiner must be mindful in selecting individuals of all manner of life and income, that no one breed defeats any other by number. Then when fair is fair, all need be done is to but measure these men by an agreed set of determinants that indicate virtue, morality, and the like, by examining the number of occurrences of these for a given period of time that is long enough that they can naturally occur and afford true representation. I will propose the following examples: the number of instances a man unjustly takes another man's life, the number of, I beg pardon, mistresses crassly attached to marriages. Oh, you laugh, Miss Moore, but only as you've not seen the goings-on in London. But only at the sterility of your speech along such a ravishing topic. Do you not find irony in the contradiction? Ha, ha, returned Miss Moore in a fine spirit. Very well then, ha, ha. But these points need not be all sour. One could also count acts of charity and sacrifice. Mr. Winter deliberately animated his 2 latter determinants so that they came unsterile as one could wish, in an attempt to manoeuvre against Miss Moore's teasing. The mystery of the sermon's affect revealed, Miss Moore revelled, matter-of-fact-like, as she stared down Westfield Road, as if the answer lied just down the way, and all that need be done to retrieve it was to merely walk the path in a determined manner. She did not turn her head back toward him for some moment, though, as she felt him looking most affectionately at her. Then, by but a second's reciprocation of this with the unapologetic wielding of her own eyes, the moment was broke, for both were sensible as to what their walk should entail and what it should not. Mr. Winter thusly retreated back to his insipid professor-like tone. Sure, there would be great difficulty in practising such an experiment. Machinery and botanical constituents are much more obliging objects for examination, for they are not shy about exhibiting everything they are that man can see, whereas a dandy and his mistress may often attempt to remain inconspicuous, and even men of charity are more at ease in the avoidance of boastfulness. Then there are the mathematics. How can one be sure what they are witnessing is truly representative of our worldly scale? Alas, Mr. Winter, on an incidental note, a man may not be so easily defined by the sum of his virtues and follies over a limited piece of time, for he may in his youth make himself drunk nightly, gambling away all that he earns, and from time to time pettily shoot another man's woodcock and buzzards to nourish his wickedness, and then upon marriage or plain old aging he may settle down into a quieter attitude. At that point we see him come to church weekly, which doesn't necessarily make him a better man, but the act itself is a symptom of the desire to be. Secondly, you may experiment all you wish, and in fact find no notion that Sunday service elevates a man's goodness, but what good would it do? The parson would not hear it, nor the deacon, nor the bishop. The flock of regulars would not either, set in their ways they are, and desiring of a little Sunday company. Further, you would be surprised at the number of country folk that are of the opinion that philosophers need not be bothered with, as they say they lack right common sense. And yet common sense tells us that the earth is flat and that the sun travels round it. Charlotte, what say you? Asked Mr. Winter. I am afraid my thoughts are rather dull, Mr. Winter, for you see I do not dare so far as my cousin. I am of the opinion that ladies needn't worry over such things, that mastering the pianoforte, the French language, and the capturing of most aspects of life by way of paint and canvas are more than enough to satiate the female mind, and am perfectly content with the tradition that morality be taught and taught again every Sunday, whether or not it need be so. Chapter 2, Scene 4. When a man asks for a woman's opinion, asserted Mrs. Edwards, they do not wish to hear it, but for her to be given a chance to agree with him, quite enthusiastically. We must always agree most enthusiastically with the greater sex, for they are kind enough to die for us and our country in war, and sometimes on the gentleman's field, though you will not hear me delighting in the latter. After having had a fine Sunday dinner consisting of venison roast and local company, the Moore ladies sat with the minister's wife in her private parlour at the Edwards home and rectory. The home was but 100 some paces downhill from Hedgely's red bricken Baptist chapel, the complex sitting near the crossroads of Main Street and King Street on the self-same road as that of Mr. Winter's home. Indeed, the man had been pleased to take them to the front door, but then made apologies to the party that he could not join them, having owned his own dinner obligations. Such was to the relief of Mrs. Edwards, who feared he would have asked her servant to do away with his jacket and waistcoat, that he could strut around topless, but had very much the opposite effect for the part of the Moores, as they wished him there, especially Harriet, if for no other reason than to counter some of Mrs. Edwards' more rigid sentiments upon the working of the world. In want of this, Harriet navigated a retort, trying her best to steer clear of impolite follies, whilst betraying not her conscience. Certainly this is the case with strangers, she replied, but you do not find that conversation between those members of the opposite sex more intimately attached, were it to wash freely and naturally as the waters of a stream, where opinions are not weighed by the sex of the issuer, could strengthen the attachment between them. Charlotte noticed Harriet was presently a bit more free with her thoughts than she normally was outside their confidence. Sure, she had been attentive to the other guests at dinner, who, secondary to her beauty, sought her attention by the easiest means proper, by asking her to partake in glasses of wine together. Such had been attenuated by the minister's presence that the rate of disappearance of the wine was not nearly as great as what one would attribute to, say, a Royal Naval Officer's dinner, yet still her cheeks reddened more readily at Mrs. Edwards' remarks than they commonly did otherwise. But Charlotte suspected a heartier influence, originating no doubt from Mr. Winter's encouragement of philosophical subject matter between them as they had walked to Hedgely, lubricating the liberties, despite Mrs. Edwards' assertions, between her cousin's mind and mouth. "Faith, child, I do not," the astonished old brute raved, "for a man knows more of the complexities of the world than does a woman, and her opinions must therefore be inferior, whilst you'll observe all that is in a stream washes but one direction. The man is the stream, the woman is but a delicate leaf that is caught upon the top of the water. It may come to pass that a woman's opinions may differ so greatly, I shudder to think, that such but altogether destroys their relations, and that would not do, especially in the confines of marriage and its eternity. Consider the exactness of Timothy 2:12. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. And I would submit that her silence starts where her mind differs. No, a man asking for an opinion of a woman is purely doing so out of politeness, and in agreeing with him, he may thusly issue great compliments to her reason. Mr. Edwards, for instance, praises me on occasion that I have a quick, womanly perception, when all I have done is comfort him in his view. And there is the man now, so attentive to his garden. Oh, Mr. Edwards! Mr. Edwards! Mrs. Edwards yelled through the parlour's open window at her husband, who had taken the opportunity to sneak off after seeing his other guests out the door, in order to take advantage of the fine weather to care for his full turnips. For though it was the day of rest, rest did not the sprouts. They die in war, and we in labour, Harriet covertly whispered in Charlotte's ear as Mr. Edwards declined his wife's best efforts to get him to join their little group, that they could appeal to Harriet to play the boxed pianoforte whilst he emitted his handsome baritone. Charlotte's eyes widened at Harriet's audacious counter, as there was not 10 feet between them and the garden window, and it was quite possible that their hostess may have heard her, though she not yet showed any sign of doing so. Charlotte shot her cousin a look to silently check her, momentarily pursing her lips, as Mr. Edwards too designed to reason with the delicate leaf that was his wife. No, it would never do presently, he insisted, and does his Pearl not remember their late afternoon guest who would be arriving at any moment? Certainly she did upon provocation, and therefore revised her wishes that he should only do what he already kept in his mind, to toil about the yard until the sound of horses came up the chapel's drive, signalling that he should attentively meet his coveted guest in front of the rectory with not the loss of a moment. "Never fret, my dears," Mrs. Edwards said, perhaps ignoring Harriet's tenuous attack. "We will catch Mr. Edwards up shortly, and then perhaps we shall have some music between our two families. Miss Moore, let me help you to a little more tea. There we are. And are you at all musical like your cousin?" she asked the older of the two Moore ladies. "A little, ma'am," said Charlotte. "I've had modest success at the pianoforte, but I'm more comfortable with my voice, having always had my cousin to rely upon for superior accompaniment." "Well, then please do sing for us. No need to be shy. We are fine listeners of music, and do not so much mind the occasional false note if the performer is spirited," their hostess cried, in what may be described as delight, considering her particular inimical character. After having explained, she fell square in the mezzo range, and that in want of a score, she and Harriet were only proficient in a few ancient songs from a historical compilation that had found its way from overseas to the Manners Library long ago, and such not overtaking Mrs. Edwards' sense of English superiority, for there were composers that may almost rival the 3 H's, Handel, Haydn, and Henry Purcell, though she would not commit that much further, so many of the medieval continentals having stunted thoughts from malnutrition and inbreeding. Harriet sat at the pianoforte and gave her the first note. Never before did such mastery of the first art grace Mrs. Edwards' Spartan parlour. With the sounding of but one arpeggiated chord that died into silence, Charlotte offered a series of legato notes, the first climbing dynamically from the stillness brought about by Harriet's initiation, and each owning their own dynamical flow, the latter of the set being sparsely supported by chords of a similar nature. In these few notes was the name of a woman, long ago poetically loved by an Italian dramatic, whose paper confessions were set to music by that of another, a Giulio Caccini, who saw the merit of such, in regard to its naturally lyrical quality, Amarilli. The first few passages, steeped in piano-driven sensitivity, capitulated to bold fortes that the poet would certainly not be mistook. "Doubt not its truth, open my breast and see it written on my heart," she sang in his native language as he referred further to his love. And though Mrs. Edwards spoke not a lick of any inferior language, she was frightfully stirred by the Moore lady's interpretation, which exuded a relentless magnitude of female sensuality that went far beyond what was expected of English women, much less gentlewomen. Indeed, she was powerless against it, and despite the small remaining pinprick of her now anaesthetised rationality working its hardest to cause her shame, the rest of her mind and body was flooded by the universally appealing Renaissance tonalities the ladies afforded the room, so that she could not move to object. She surely was bewitched. Charlotte was practised, nuanced, and wielded a command of her voice that the average bourgeoisie lady, whipped to conform to a given level of excellence at an early age that her kin may be assured of their superiority over the plebs, did not. Such likely came from a full-throated love of nature, from the momentary freedom from restriction, from the self-same instinct to exert oneself onto their surround, just as Mr. Winter and the other industrialists so devotedly did, and perhaps paradoxically from inherited intelligence secondary to the lack of cousinly marriages in her family, which afflicted her betters along the peerage ladder. And as the last few notes were absorbed back into the stillness of the room, and all that remained were 3 females blinking at the momentary emptiness in front of their unfocused gazes, the music's spell not entirely broken, Mrs. Edwards was, for once, at a loss for words, having had her strength for critical commentary momentarily sapped. "Well, dear, that was—" A knock at the parlour door, and she was saved. Not one of the three, having had their minds to the music, had perceived the arrival of the Edwards guest into the rectory, attentively followed by his host. Nor had they heard these fellows advance down the hallway toward the parlour, naturally drawn to the performance. Nevertheless, by the swinging of the door, a young red-headed gentleman did present, smiling as ever one could in the grasp of certain joy, followed of course by Mr. Edwards. His cup was overflowing, and it did at once spill out onto Mrs. Edwards, causing her to light up in a way so very far removed from her usual affliction. This prompting a series of quickly exchanged looks between the Moores, surprised that she owned such a capacity for bliss. "Oh, Mrs. Edwards, how happy I am to see you looking so well," he exclaimed as he took her hands, and no doubt put into the finest form by Gloucestershire's greatest performers. "I have not heard the like." The performers smiled at this, and did not at all doubt his sincerity, for it was a rare treat to see a man so unreservedly happy. "Oh, I am sure, dear Mr. Wyatt," she returned, "and I was just on to bestow my finest compliments to our friends here, when but the knock at the door, and you through it. Ha, ha, ha." "Mr. Wyatt, these are our Woodbridge neighbours," Mr. Edwards instructed his guest, uncommonly bursting himself. "A Miss Charlotte Moore, daughter of our squire Mr. George Moore, and her cousin Miss Harriet Moore, daughter of the Anglican parson, and Mr. Jonathan Moore. Miss Moores, may I introduce Mr. Henry Wyatt, also a squire of sorts from Norcombe. And with property all round, Miss Moores, from Bourton to Cadley," Mrs. Edwards hastily injected, as excited and boastful as if she were the plot's recent and rightful owner. "Oh, I am but a field man," Mr. Wyatt insisted, further explaining, "who by luck and providence has been able to retire my earlier efforts, that I now stand before you thus. I confess I am recently inherited, and yet still long to cart up the corn by and by during this time of year. It is nostalgic now that it is not necessary. Oh, ha, ha, ha! Norcombe, I believe that is close to Sezincote, which my father many a year back has visited," said Charlotte, in an effort to politely further the conversation. Then, upon the conclusion of this, and a brief moment of thoughtfulness, she again drew breath to signal the birth of a fresher idea, and added, "Mr. Wyatt, this may seem amiss, but are you at all familiar with any Yorkshire families tending a living at any of the parishes around your parts?" "I am afraid I am not," he replied. "You will have to forgive me, Miss Charlotte, but I am only a plain Baptist, and have little on the workings of the local Anglican parishes, though I am pleased to have some, whomever they may be, as neighbours, for there are occasions where our fields do abut," he further offered, in an attempt to remain congenial at this odd request. "Norcombe is a small knot of Worcester, a small island of land surrounded on all sides by Gloucestershire, dear," Mrs. Edwards added, as if such cleared up any confusion on Charlotte's part, regarding what Mr. Wyatt would be expected to know of his surrounds. Indeed, whatever he did lack in the knowledge of his country neighbours, Mrs. Edwards did not, concerning the man himself, as was becoming apparent to the Moore ladies by these incidental statements. Through and through she seemed to know him. However, such was neither here nor there in comparison to the next leg of confessions the man had for the group, he being pleasantly anxious to arrive at their conjuring. "Miss Harriet, Mrs. Edwards has told me so much of you, that you often walk to the bookstore here in Hedgely and purchase sermons, reviews, and all manner of items. I am in complete awe. I give you joy. I am not so well read, but designed to better myself that I may understand both my property accounts, and forgive me, Mr. Edwards, my Bible." Chapter 2, Scene 5. Harriet Moore sat the following morning at her own private writing desk with pen and paper, that it may realise its purpose, and like the many times before this, she hers. It was a cool morning, with little hope of it not being so, given the presently greyed coals in her fireplace, and she was thankful for the poor soul of a scullery maid who was long up before her to rebuild the kitchen fire and boil water, that she may take a hot cup and a pinch of tea leaves to her room and employ herself in her usual rituals concerning the writing of a letter to her future self. Oh, that woman! Quite clear were her intentions, Throw me in the river herself she would, veil and all, that she may usurp Charlotte or even Mother, and pull me back out only never to let go. And I do regret her misuse of the man too, for he is rather a pleasant— I hesitate to use the word gentleman secondary to his upbringing, but perhaps his fair attitude does somewhat repair this discrepancy. Certainly, if he had been allowed a bit more of an education, he would not be such a willing instrument, luxuriating in the woman's hand. On and on they did go, that I believe I've discovered their founding ligature. Both of the men's fathers were itinerant ministers of little means, Mr. Edwards being old enough to have existed initially as what they called a paedobaptist, though both being of the mind that the hasty formation and building of churches answered well to the inflation of their lineages. The paedobaptist Edwards, of course, did fulfil his desire with the red bricken building that inflames Upper Hedgely, whose other dwellings are of the more sensible local golden stone, that they do not thus call out against the countryside so rudely. And now, apparently, it falls to the junior Wyatt's lot to now commission yet another plain building nearest Norcombe House as it ever can be, for though he did not outright say it, it seemed he were constructing questions and comments in order to benefit from Mr. Edwards' authority regarding the duties of a Baptist minister, which came from a personal desire. Would the elder gentleman oblige as a mentor was not established. For my part, I would have him married to a governess, who may indeed fulfil his designs, whilst he retain a competent but not overly ambitious steward, much like Uncle's Mr. Wesley, the two being kept in check by one another, that no overwhelming advantage against him would be present. Then perhaps the purchase of an officer's commission would do, that some measure of respect may permanently be applied to him, regardless the accomplishment his mind does or does not eventually achieve. I confess, though, I'm ignorant of any restrictions the regiments or navy may have against his faith, having seen even in our area a certain school mistress dismissed on such grounds. He does, however, talk well enough, a function of his age, I'm sure, youth being much accommodative to such swings of circumstance. But oh, what miserable countenances did I encounter when I explained I was not available next Sunday for dinner, that the lot of us may repeat yesterday's episode, save no doubt the addition of Mr. Wyatt smiling across the table from me, making love by way of the decanter, on account of the first of Father's afternoon lectures occurring then, which I would not miss, even discounting our beloved relations. Charlotte, too, I believe, could sense the uproar stationed just behind Mrs. Edwards' eyes at this, and we guests did all hear our host issue, "Tolerance, Mrs. Edwards, tolerance." A few rooms removed, during their momentary leave to scrounge up a few biscuits and coffee, at least those of us listening sharply enough and not enraptured by Charlotte's dissertation on Mozart's magic flute. Still, I am thankful that Charlotte was less observant earlier in the churchyard, when I just about destroyed myself and my freedom, when I misspoke, or rather forgot to misspeak during our initial gathering of Mr. Winter to our party. What a thing our society is that we must keep the occasional event unaddressed, even in the private confidence of our cousin and sister. Forgive me, dear Charlotte, were I at all to pass early, God between us and evil, and you to inherit the key that unlocks the box where these pages are to be kept, with the others. Mr. Winter did attempt to repair my folly, certainly for my protection, yet considering it did catch me unaware, it checked me somewhat cruelly, for I have but the highest regard for the man. He does not dote on me, as the other men in our village do, providing nothing beyond compliments of my physical form, or in the case of the London dandies, promises of luxury that I do not desire, beyond the comfort to read and walk at my pleasure, which Uncle has already provided. He, on the other hand, discovers me philosophically, and I him, though he is much more clever than myself or any other soul I've known. He is curious to my opinion, and not just in the manner Mrs. Edwards would have us believe, motivated simply by an unbiddable desire to know everything in all that surrounds him. But what of this young Yorkshire lady? Am I at all of equal weight by him in comparison? Or now that I've further displayed myself, is she a handsome dream floating above my sinking reach? She has, at least, and not to my favour, caught Charlotte's attention,